everyone else, we will be in John chapter 19, finishing out, or beginning chapter 19 today, excuse me. And over the last couple weeks, I want to backtrack a little bit. We have looked at a couple different, very key pieces of these last final moments of Jesus' life. And so as Jesus finishes his moments with the disciples, and he moves into being arrested, we see the denial of Peter and Jesus being questioned. We talked about how Jesus takes us from shame to grace, and just like we see in the life of Peter, he did not have to stay in the shame of denying Jesus. And we will see throughout the book of Acts that Peter would go on to do these amazing things and would go on to be the cornerstone of this early church and would establish such a beautiful ministry throughout his time, that he did not have to stay in that shame, that Jesus takes us from shame to grace. We talked about how we need to exchange our self-confidence for dependence on Christ. When we rely on our own power and our own ability, we lose out on who Jesus truly is. And finally, we talked about how Jesus transforms our fear and denial into boldness, that we need to step out in boldness in all that we do. We do not need to keep that boldness for ourselves, but to give the gospel to this world that so desperately needs it in boldness through Christ Jesus. And last week we see this trial before Pilate in the end of John chapter 18. And we talked about how as the one true king, Jesus' kingdom is in heaven. It is not here on earth. He is not a king that was coming to establish authority or take authority from Rome, but to establish his authority in heaven. And how through Jesus we receive comfort through conviction. That there will be times where the Spirit will convict us, but we receive that comfort from Christ, knowing that He did so much for us by dying on the cross for you and I. And finally, we talked about, again, we need to live both with freedom and truth through Christ. That when we live a life that is reflective of Jesus Christ, we need to do it with the freedom that He provides us and the truth that He gave us when He was here on this earth. And today we're going to jump right into John chapter 19. I think I might have bit off a little bit more than I should have this week, but I want to look at this picture as a whole picture. So we're going to start with John chapter 19, starting in verse 1. And it tells us this. It says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, 'Hail the King of the Jews,' and struck him with their hands." And so previously, Pilate said of Jesus that he had found no fault in the things that he was doing. That this was a religious matter, not a legal matter. Yet he commanded this severe, brutal punishment for a man that he knew had not done anything that deserved this type of punishment. And it has been suggested by many theologians that Pilate wanted to help Jesus in this moment, hoping that if he would beat him in front of all of the Jews that were there in this moment, that maybe this would be enough. But Pilate gave this order, and so Jesus was beaten according to the Roman practices. And the blows came from the whip with many leather strands, each having sharp pieces of bone and metal at the end of them. And it reduced his back to raw flesh. And it was not unusual for a criminal to die from these kinds of beatings, even before crucifixion. And that was one of the purposes of these beatings. When we look at Roman crucifixion, it really played three purposes. It was used to punish the prisoner and maybe to gain confession of the crimes of the prisoner. But also, in cases of crucifixion, these beatings were used to weaken the victim so that they would die more quickly on the cross. Pilate hoped that, again, that this punishment would satisfy the crowd. God said that neither then, as part of the capital punishment, nor in order to elicit the truth, but in the ill-judged hope that this minor punishment would satisfy the Jews. Here in this moment, we also see the mockery begin amongst the soldiers. They would twist the crown of thorns and provide for him a purple robe. They would say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And this was all intended to humiliate Jesus. The Jewish rulers had already mocked Jesus as the Messiah, and now Rome did the same thing, mocking him as a king. They took the crown of thorns, because kings, of course, wear crowns, but not crowns of torture. And the specific thorn bushes of this region have very long, hard, sharp thorns. And this was a crown that was cut and pierced and bloodied the head of Jesus. They would put him in purple robes, because kings and rulers often wore purple, because the dyes to make the fabrics were expensive, and the purple robe was intended as cruel irony. And they said, "Hail, King of the Jews." Kings are greeted with the royal titles. So in their spite, they mocked Jesus with this title. Again, it was meant to humiliate him in this moment. But it was also meant to humiliate the Jews. It was as though they were saying, "Is this the best king that you can bring forward? This is your guy. Look at him. Beaten and bruised. This is your king." It continues by saying they also beat him with their hands, mocking him, showing all of the cruelty and wickedness. And Matthew would go on to add that Jesus was stripped, given a reed as mocking a royal scepter, that the soldiers bowed their knees before Jesus, offering mocking homage and honor, and that they spat on Jesus. But even in this moment, Pilate continues to tell us in verse 4, Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Pilate repeated this statement that he first said back in chapter 18, declaring the innocence of Jesus, that he had done nothing wrong, yet here I am beating him for you. As a judge, Pilate had both reason and responsibility to set Jesus free with no punishment, instead of the humiliation and brutality that he endured. We continue on into verse 5. And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the other officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd, being beaten and mocked with blood, sweat, and spit all over his body. And perhaps Pilate hoped that the sad sight would make them feel sorry for him. But instead, that is not the case. Charles Spurgeon says that many a crown has been secured by blood, and so is this, but it is his own blood. Many a throne has been established by suffering, and so is this, but he himself bears the pain. Pilate invited the crowd to look at the suffering Jesus and to look with careful consideration, saying, "Behold, look at this man. Look at what we are doing to him. Even though I have told you time and time again, he has done nothing." There's a sense in which Pilate spoke for God here, who invites all of humanity to behold the man, to see the man of men, the perfect man, the tested and approved ideal of all humanity. Yet we have once again the Jewish leaders being the one to yell out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And we aren't told what the crowd's reaction is in this moment. I would love to know what the common people were feeling in this moment. Perhaps they did feel a moment of sympathy for this remarkable, strong man in such circumstances. But whatever the crowd felt, the religious leaders continued screaming, "Crucify him, crucify him." They hated Jesus. They hated what he stood for. He stood for what God had sent him to do. That was goodness and faithfulness. And they could not stand him. Pilate, once again for the third time, pronounces Jesus' innocence in this moment. Merrill Tenney says that Pilate must have realized that the Sanhedrin could not execute the sentence. We continue on into verse 7. It says, "And the Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and according to that law, He ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Here in John's account, with the religious leaders showing their true charges against Jesus, that they hated the fact that he claimed to be God. They wanted him dead not because he claimed to be the king of the Jews, but because he claimed to be God, the unique Son of God. And there was something about this that terrified Pilate. He wasn't angry or amused when he learned that Jesus made himself the Son of God. He was afraid. Pilate saw something in Jesus, even beaten and bloodied, that made him think that it could be true that the man before him was more than just a man. Why else would he pull Jesus back and question him alone? Pilate wanted Jesus to defend himself, to give Pilate more of a reason to let him go in his innocence. He wanted Jesus to explain what made him different than the dozens of prisoners that Pilate had judged and executed before. Yet Jesus already told Pilate that he was the king of a kingdom that was not of this world. And Jesus already said where he was from. Therefore, Jesus does not answer him in this moment. Though he already had the answer, one can say Pilate asked the right question. Tasker says that his question is almost the most pertinent question that can be asked about him. To know where Jesus comes from is to know what the most important thing about him is. We continue on into verse 10. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greatest sin." Pilate could not believe in this moment that Jesus wouldn't defend himself. He couldn't believe that Jesus wouldn't beg for his life as so many others had done before him. He couldn't believe that Jesus was not awed and intimidated by the representative of Rome who judged him. David Guzik says that the general silence of Jesus before his accusers and judges fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah 53:7. As a sheep before its shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth. That Jesus would stand in silence because he could have said the right things that would have got him released in this moment. But he knew what you and I both know, that Jesus had to fulfill what he came here to fulfill, and that was to die on the cross for you and I. But Pilate continues on. "Do you not know that I have the power? I can kill you or I can release you." And he was amazed that Jesus wasn't intimidated by this power. Pilate had no power over Jesus. Why would he be intimidated? In his understanding of power, Pilate felt that he held a position and was mystified that Jesus didn't see it. Pilate thought he had power, but what he had was the power to do wrong, the power to do harm. He didn't have the power to do what was right. The right thing to do was to release an obviously innocent man instead of sending him to his death. But Pilate was weak. He was weak before the strength of the religious leaders and weak before the crowd. To say, "I have the power to do what the crowd wants me to do," is to say, "I have no power whatsoever." The same man who claimed to have all the power tried to wash his hands of this decision back in Matthew 27, claiming, "I didn't really want to do this." But Jesus gives him just a very simple but very eloquent answer, explaining the true nature of power to Pilate and thinking of the Roman governor. Rome had the power, but in reality, God held that power in his hands. Jesus understood that Pilate had power. He simply insisted that this power was granted by God and not inherent to Pilate or to Rome or to anybody else that feels as though they had power here on this earth. And Jesus, in his final words here in this moment to Pilate, tells him, "The one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Jesus didn't say Pilate was without sin. We had already talked about Pilate's sin. He was a horrific man that had done horrific things. But he wanted Pilate to know in this moment that the religious leaders were guilty of a greater sin, betraying the one that God had sent to this earth. We pick back up in verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, in an Aramaic Gabbathera. We sense panic in the Roman governor here. That there's a panic that is happening here. That the panic was greater when his wife told him to let the accused go free because she had a dream. Back in Matthew 27, he knew this man was innocent, a man not like any other prisoner he had ever seen before, that he should be free, yet he felt the full force of the crowd and the religious leaders demanding that he put him to death. So then they start to speak to Pilate's authority, to his ego. "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's." Pilate was an unremarkable man who had only held this power because he had married the granddaughter of the emperor. And holding this position only by relation, Pilate would be greatly concerned that his relationship would be damaged. The religious leaders in the crowd knew Pilate's weak point and they pressed it. "If you are going to stand by Caesar, then you have to put this man to death." Pilate in this moment was ready to deliver his final judgment, presenting Jesus both before the crowd and before the judgment seat. And in truth, it was Pilate who was on judgment, not Jesus. Jesus already knew his judgment. He already knew what was to come. But yet here is now Pilate sitting in judgment himself. We continue into verse 14. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to be crucified. So they took Jesus. Again, this raises a difficult chronological question previously mentioned in John chapter 18. But John's point is nevertheless clear. The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world is ready for sacrifice at Passover. That he was the final Passover lamb. Pilate offered this sacrificial lamb before the people for their inspection. He may have meant to mock Jesus in the crowd, presenting the thorn-crowned, bloodied, and beaten man with the purple rag across his ripped open back. The crowd saw Jesus in his misery and dignity and responded by screaming, "Away with him! Crucify him!" John Alford says that the words, "Behold your king," seem to have been spoken in irony to the Jews, in the same spirit in which afterwards the title was written over the cross. There are times when people are angry enough with God and his goodness that they think or wish him dead. It is far more common for people to simply want God to disappear, for people to wish him away with him. But the crowd falling to the same kingdom they had outrightly and openly opposed, finally declared their allegiance to the king. We have no king but Caesar. They rejected Jesus, they chose Barabbas, and in this crazy and contradictory manner, they both chose the revolutionary and swore allegiance to Caesar. They didn't care about Barabbas. They didn't care about Caesar. They cared about getting what they wanted out of Pilate. It appeared that Jesus was on trial before Pilate, but in an even greater sense, Pilate was on trial before Jesus. And Pilate failed the test. In fear of the crowd, he sent a man he knew to be innocent to a tortured death. One theologian says that we may do the exact same thing today of what Pilate did. He is simply an example of a man who lacks decision of character, who does not possess the courage of his conviction, who tries to compromise with wrong, who disobeys conscience through fear of personal loss. That is why Pilate went through with this. What will it cost me if I don't put this man to death? Pride, ego, whatever it is, took over Pilate in this moment. Verse 17. And he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. According to the Roman custom, Jesus carried his own cross from the place of sentencing to the place of crucifixion. Before the Romans put the man on the cross, they put the cross on the man, forcing him to carry it in public, intended to draw attention to the condemned. And if we look at the history of crucifixion, the Persians had invented crucifixion, but one could say that the Romans perfected it and made it an institution in their culture. It was the form of execution reserved for the worst criminals and the lowest class. Crucifixion was designed to make the victim die publicly, slowly, with great pain and humiliation. This was the form of death God ordained for Jesus to die, and the death that he submitted to in the will of God. Crucifixion was so awful and degrading that polite Romans wouldn't even talk about it in public. One Roman historian called crucifixion a torture fit for only slaves. The gospel writers don't give a whole lot of detail in explanation of the crucifixion, and there were several reasons for this. The original readers, the ones that John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote these letters to, they were familiar with the practice. They didn't need it to be explained to them. Many of them had watched this happen. They had seen the way this worked. They didn't need to be explained to what this looked like. The gospel writers also would take care to not use language or description that would cause manipulation of emotion. Their job was to simply tell the story. Here is what happened, here is exactly what happened, and why it happened. The gospel writers also knew that the greater suffering of Jesus was inward and spiritual, even greater than his outward and physical suffering. But it tells us here is Jesus in the middle of these two men who probably rightfully deserved what they were going through. There were 3 scheduled for crucifixion that day. These two men and Barabbas. Jesus took the place of Barabbas. This was another way that Jesus was identified with sinners in his death. But not only did he take the place of Barabbas, he takes the place of you and I. But it tells us here is Jesus in the middle of these two men. And while this was literally true, Jesus of the 3 crosses in the middle, but as a concept, there was many ways that this could be said that it was Jesus at the center. Because Jesus was centered among humanity. Jesus never distanced himself from the common men and freely interacted with those thought to be great. From the beginning of his life, he lived as one of us. Jesus died among men and women, Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, high class and no class, the educated, the uneducated, the religious, the secular, the guilty, the innocent, the weepers and the mockers. Those who were moved in this moment and those who hated him. Not only that, but Jesus was centered among sinful men. His enemies thought this would make his suffering worse. They thought he would be bothered to see himself in the low company he died with. In his death, the righteously religious mocked him, and the disciples forsook him. Yet Jesus was centered among the sinners at the end. Jesus was also centered among confusion. Back in Matthew 27, Matthew tells us that when Jesus cried out in agony to his Father, the people around him didn't understand. And some even mocked him and found it amusing. Jesus was also centered between the believing and the rejecting. Between the robbers that mocked him and the criminal who changed because of him. Jesus was centered between God and man. Jesus on the cross took all of the punishment for sin that was deserved. At the cross, Jesus was both the priest and the offering. Finally, Jesus was centered in all of God's work throughout history. We do not look at Jesus in the center with pity as if we should feel sorry for poor Jesus. He was a winner because of the cross. That he defeated death because of this cross. This was the greatest victory that could have ever been won. We continue on into verse 19. So Pilate wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" And Pilate answered, "I have written what I have written." This again was according to Roman custom. The one to be crucified had his crime written out and his title hung around his neck as he carried the cross. Then the title was placed at the top of the cross so that all would know the reason of crucifixion. He wanted them to know, the Romans wanted them to know what this man had done. So Pilate wrote the name of Jesus, the same name he was identified and arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane with. He wrote what was said to be his crime, that he claimed to be the King of the Jews. And even in his death, Jesus was identified with the humble and obscure Nazareth. Even in his death, Jesus was recognized as a king. Kings of this world take their throne through others dying. Jesus was proclaimed king to the whole world through his own death. The title was also the proper justification of the sinless nature of Jesus. On either side were criminals with descriptions of their own crime. On the cross of Jesus was simply describing who he was, which was no crime at all because it was the truth. The religious leaders, of course, object to this title. They felt it was false because they did not believe that Jesus was who he said he was. They also believed it was demeaning because it showed Rome's power to humiliate and torture even the King of the Jews. And even after their pushback, Pilate stands by what he did. If this is what you've accused him of, this is what he is dying for. One might say that despite himself, Pilate honored Jesus by calling him the king that he was, giving him the true description of who he was. Adam Clark says, that is, I will not alter what I have written. The Roman laws forbid the sentence to be altered when it's pronounced. And as this inscription was considered as the sentence pronounced against our Lord, therefore it will not be changed. He would die in this moment, signifying the reason that he was the king that God had sent. We continue on. Verse 23, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each of the soldiers, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture which said, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So the soldiers did these things. Of course, these crucifixions were supervised by soldiers, both to keep order and to make sure the condemned actually died. And on the cross, Jesus retained no material possessions. Even the clothes on his back were taken from him, and his tunic was awarded by petty gambling. The soldiers did all of this unknowing the fulfillment of the prophecy in Psalms 22. The Son of God died for the sins of this world. Men carelessly laughed and played games at his feet. We finish out here in verse 25. It says, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clovis, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. It's difficult for us to understand the agony that Mary was going through, seeing her son being crucified. She was a witness to the pain, humiliation, suffering, shame, and death of her son. And as Mary and Joseph brought Jesus into this world and dedicated him at the temple, a godly man by the name of Simon saw Jesus, took him into his arms, and blessed the baby Jesus. Yet he also said to Mary, yes, a sword will pierce through your soul, through your own soul also. Mary experienced this throughout her son's ministry. She watched him be rejected, opposed, slandered, and plotted against. Yet this was the ultimate fulfillment of that solemn promise. Of all of those who looked upon Jesus at the cross, none suffered as Mary did. But here stands Mary and her sister and Mary Magdalene. These faithful women were there with Jesus through his agony on the cross to honor him and to support his mother Mary. These were the same women, the 2 Marys were the same women that would also be the first to discover the empty tomb. The first ones to discover the evidence of his resurrection. But then John tells us his experience in this moment. John often referred to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. And this was his humble way to refer to himself throughout this story, as he does multiple times throughout the Gospel of John. John tells us in this moment that he stood there and watched these things with his own eyes. This wasn't a story that he heard later down the road, but one that he watched. And even in this moment, Jesus still showed his love and care and consideration. He loved his mother to the end, showing that even on the cross, his attention was directed to others and not upon himself. If there was ever a moment when Jesus deserved to be focused on himself, this was it. Yet he remained other-centered even to the end. But John and Mary both obeyed this solemn command from Jesus. though it was a remarkable thing that Jesus commanded this. And Mary had other children that had been born after Jesus, and there are references of the half-brothers and sisters of Jesus throughout both Matthew and John. Despite this, Jesus left the care of his mother to John the disciple. And there's a few speculations that happen here, and David Guzik provides these speculations, but he says perhaps Jesus did this to emphasize that our relationships in him and in the kingdom are even more important than those by blood. Perhaps Jesus did this to honor the one disciple who was courageous enough to stand with Jesus and be present at the crucifixion. Perhaps Jesus did this because his siblings did not follow him as a disciple during his earthly ministry and did not yet believe on him. And Jesus wanted to leave his mother with a believer. Jesus perhaps did this knowing that John was the only disciple who would die from natural death and would outlive even the siblings of Jesus. But perhaps Jesus did this out of simple wisdom and foresight. In my personal opinion, I think that Jesus did this because he knew that John had heard his words all of his ministry. That he knew that John had listened and heard that he was coming back. Maybe out of all of those who were there, John could be the one to offer just a moment of clarification to his mother. This is not the end. He has promised us that he's coming back. But as we see, Jesus did not tell her to take care of my mother. All Jesus needed to do was to describe the new relationship, and he knew the rest would be followed properly. In the same way, there are many commands for a holy life that Jesus need not specifically give us. But if the relationship is ordered correctly, the conduct will follow. If we listen to the commands of Jesus, our lives will fall into place exactly like he wants them to. As we wrap up there today, there's a few things that I want us to pull out of this text. The first one is this: the cross is not defeat. The cross was God's plan for our redemption. It was the plan for your redemption, for my redemption, for all of those who came to know Christ. Pilate and the soldiers thought that they were in control, but every detail fulfills Scripture. Everything that they did in this moment fulfilled what God had already spoke to be true. And as the world sees weakness, we see the wisdom and the power of God in this moment. Jesus is declared the King of the Jews in mockery, yet the sign speaks to the truth about his eternal reign. That even in this moment of dying on this cross, this horrific death, that Jesus was still king. That no matter what Pilate did or these Roman soldiers did, no matter what happened here on this earth, it does not change what God is doing in heaven. For us, this needs to correct our perspective on suffering. God's purposes can be at work even when it looks like defeat. In Jesus' suffering, we know that there was a purpose behind it. The same can be said for you and I. There are times where we are going to suffer. There are times where we are going to face things that we are not in control of. But God is. But God is in control. This also shows us that true kingship is shown in sacrificial love, not in force. Jesus never once forced anybody to walk with him or to give their lives to him, but he sacrificed for them nonetheless. This should finally reshape the way that we think about the cross as the center point, not just of history, but of our hearts. The center point of what you and I believe as believers in Jesus as we walk this earth. The next thing I want to pull out of this is, instead of grief, we should find comfort in the cross. We absolutely feel grief at Jesus' suffering, the cruel beatings, the mockery, the humiliation. But ultimately, we should feel love and awe knowing that he endured this for us, bearing sin and shame that was ours, not his. That this was not because of what he had done, but because what you and I have done. That we should feel comfort in his care, even from the cross. Showing the compassion that he had on his mother in this moment and telling John, behold the mother. Showing us his heart of compassion, even in his pain. Even in his pain, he was still compassionate. For us, this should reshape how we feel and growing in our gratitude of Jesus' sacrifice. Humbling us because we see the weight of our sin in what he had to endure. And it should fill us with comfort. If he cared for his mother in that moment, he can surely care for us in our moments of trial, of weakness, of failure, of pain and suffering. Jesus cares about you. This moment should show that his compassion does not stop in his pain. That it does not stop in our pain either. Finally, we should live in the light of the cross. As Luke 9 tells us, we are called to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow him. And like John, who received Mary as his own, we are called to care for one another in a tangible, sacrificial way. That we should love one another and show compassion to one another, just as Jesus did for you and I. That we are to act as people whose lives are marked by the love and humility of Christ, bearing one another's burdens and living not for ourselves, but for him who died for us. This should put us into motion and into action, moving us to live sacrificially, putting others before ourselves. This should encourage us to stand firm in our faith when following Jesus costs us. This should inspire us to share the message of the cross because it is the power of God for salvation. I don't know where you're at in your walk with Christ. I don't know where you are in your relationship with Christ, but if you are walking with Christ, this should encourage us. If he can die for us, we should live for him. If he can die a brutal death on the cross, you and I should be living a life for him. And if you're here today and you've never given your life to Christ, my encouragement is this: that Christ died on a cross for you long before you were ever born, long before you ever walked this earth. Because he loved you enough to sacrifice himself in the most brutal way possible so that you did not have to face death.